Chicago, 1980s. Women were vanishing. Days later, their bodies turned up, mutilated, tortured, and marked with the same horrifying signature. Police thought it was one sadistic killer, but what they uncovered was far worse. A satanic cult of 4 men who hunted together, killed together, and performed rituals too disturbing to imagine. This is the nightmare of the Ripper Crew, the most sadistic cult in American history. In the early 1980s, Chicago became the hunting ground of one of the most disturbing cults in American history. Women were vanishing off the streets, only to be discovered days or even months later in horrifying conditions. Each victim carried the same chilling mark: her left breast had been brutally removed. At first, investigators believed they were chasing a lone sadistic killer, but the truth was far darker. This was the work of not one man but 4, a gang of twisted predators who called themselves the Ripper Crew. Led by a man obsessed with satanic rituals and unspeakable violence, the group kidnapped, tortured, and murdered women with unimaginable cruelty. Their crimes were so brutal that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. Survivors' testimonies revealed details that sounded more like scenes from a nightmare than real life: rituals, cannibalism, and trophies kept as proof of their sadism. This wasn't just a murder spree, it was a cult fueled by fear, power, and blood. Tonight we revisit their crimes, their trials, and the chilling reality that while most of them never walked free again, one of the Ripper Crew members is still out there, living among us. Chicago, May 23, 1981. It was an ordinary spring evening when 28-year-old Linda Sutton vanished. To her family, Linda wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman with dreams, and like many in Chicago at the time, she was simply trying to make ends meet. But what her loved ones didn't know was that Linda had just become the first victim of a nightmare that would haunt the city for years to come. 10 days after her disappearance, searchers made a discovery that froze them in their tracks. Linda's body was found in a quiet field near Villa Park, just outside the city. At first glance it was clear this wasn't just a murder, this was something far darker. Her body had been horribly mutilated, but the detail that struck investigators, the one that would soon become the killer's signature, was chilling: her left breast had been removed. For detectives, this detail stood out immediately. Why take the time to perform such a deliberate, grotesque act? Murders were not uncommon in a city the size of Chicago, but mutilation of this kind pointed to something ritualistic, something personal, something twisted beyond comprehension. In the beginning, police didn't know what to make of it. Some detectives thought it was an isolated act of violence, maybe a crime of passion, maybe a sadistic killer acting alone, but others saw the brutality and feared something worse: the birth of a serial predator. Linda's family, devastated and heartbroken, pushed for answers. They wanted justice. They wanted closure, but the police had little evidence to work with. There were no reliable witnesses, no leads that stood out, and no obvious suspect. Just one horrifying fact: somewhere out there, a killer had struck, and could strike again. Looking back, Linda Sutton's murder would come to symbolize the start of a new kind of terror for Chicago. The way she was taken, the way her body was treated, and the lack of remorse shown by whoever was responsible all pointed to something larger than a random killing. It was the beginning of what would later be called the work of the Ripper Crew. At the time, however, no one could imagine the scale of what was coming. For police, Linda's murder was another case to solve. For the public, it was just another headline. But behind the scenes, a cult of killers had already begun their spree, one that would soon reveal itself in the most horrifying ways. Linda Sutton's death wasn't just the first, it was the opening chapter of one of the darkest true crime stories in American history. In any murder investigation, detectives look for patterns, the small haunting details that connect one crime scene to another. And in the case of the Ripper crew, that pattern was as unmistakable as it was horrifying. After Linda Sutton's body was discovered in 1981, police initially thought they might be dealing with a one-time sadistic act, but then, more women began to vanish, and their bodies began to resurface in the suburbs of Chicago. Each discovery carried the same haunting detail: the left breast of every victim had been removed. This detail was more than just mutilation. To investigators, it screamed ritual. It was deliberate, repeated, and central to the killer's motives. When the second victim, Lorraine Borowski, disappeared in May 1982, the pattern became undeniable. Lorraine was a 21-year-old secretary who vanished on her way to work at a real estate office. Her body was found 5 months later, placed on top of a grave in a cemetery. Once again, the same brutal signature was present: the left breast cut away. Police now had two victims, connected by the same mutilation. It was no coincidence. Whoever was responsible was repeating their crime with a twisted consistency. Soon after Schwaymack, another young woman, was abducted. Her body was found months later, and the investigators' worst fears were confirmed. The same gruesome removal had taken place. By now, detectives were no longer debating whether they had a serial killer on their hands. They were certain, and this killer wasn't just targeting women, he was ritualizing their deaths. The most chilling confirmation came when a victim finally survived. Angel York, abducted in 1982, lived through the ordeal. She had been handcuffed and tortured, but unlike the others, she wasn't killed. Instead, she was left with horrifying injuries: her left breast slashed with a knife before being thrown from a moving van. Angel survived, but her injuries carried the same disturbing mark that tied her to the other women. This consistency created a terrifying picture. The Ripper crew weren't just killing women, they were performing rituals, marking every victim with the same mutilation, as if it was part of some unholy sacrament. The police had seen serial killers before, but this was different. This wasn't about opportunity. This wasn't even just about murder. It was about ritual, obsession, and a twisted form of worship. The signature became the crew's calling card, their horrifying stamp on Chicago, and it was this pattern, repeated across multiple victims, that allowed police to link the cases and realize they were not hunting a lone predator, but something far more terrifying. In many true crime cases, justice only comes after countless lives are lost. But in the case of the Ripper crew, it was the bravery of survivors that exposed the nightmare lurking in Chicago. The first breakthrough came with Angel York. After being abducted and tortured, she was miraculously left alive. Barely able to move, covered in wounds, Angel gave investigators a crucial piece of information. Her attacker was not working alone. She described multiple men in the van, each playing a role in the attack. For the first time, police realized this wasn't the work of a single sadistic serial killer. It was a group, a cult. This revelation changed everything. Serial killers are terrifying enough on their own, but a group of men working together, encouraging each other, feeding off each other's brutality, that was something almost unheard of. It made them harder to track, harder to predict, and far more dangerous. Then, another survivor, Beverly Washington, came forward. In December of 1982, Beverly was found unconscious near railroad tracks, clinging to life. Like the others, she had been stabbed and mutilated, and once again her left breast had been removed. Against all odds, Beverly survived. When she regained consciousness, her testimony provided detectives with something even more valuable, a description of the van used in the abductions. She remembered details about the inside, about the men, and about how they worked together. This was the lead investigators desperately needed. With the descriptions from Angel and Beverly, police began piecing together a profile of not just one man, but an entire crew of killers. The survivors' courage gave detectives the first real chance at tracking down the perpetrators. Without them, the Ripper crew might have continued their reign of terror for much longer. It's hard to imagine the strength it took for these women to relive their trauma in front of detectives, to share details about the men who had left them scarred for life, but their bravery became the turning point in the investigation. Angel and Beverly weren't just survivors, they were the voices that spoke for the women who didn't make it out alive. Their testimonies revealed the shocking truth. Chicago wasn't being terrorized by one monster, it was being terrorized by four. When detectives traced the van described by Beverly Washington, the trail led them to one man, David Gecht. At first glance, Gecht seemed ordinary, a repairman, a family man, someone who blended into Chicago life without raising suspicion. But beneath the surface, he was the orchestrator of one of the most sadistic cults America had ever seen. Gecht's motel rooms were referred to as his satanic chapel. To outsiders they were nothing more than cheap lodgings. But inside the reality was far darker. This was where kidnapped women were brought, tortured, mutilated, and killed. The music blasting from his room wasn't for entertainment. It was to cover the screams of his victims. Gecht had created a twisted ritual for himself and his followers. After murdering women, he would remove their breasts and place them in a sealed box. According to testimonies from his accomplices, there were at least 15 inside. Even more horrifying, Gecht would slice off pieces of flesh and eat them raw, insisting it was part of a satanic ritual. He told his crew it was a way of gaining power, of pleasing the devil they claimed to worship. This wasn't just killing, this was cult activity, ritualistic murder mixed with cannibalism and necrophilia. Gecht's control over the group was terrifying. Men who on their own might never have committed such crimes became his willing participants. They were drawn into his world of satanic obsession, following his every command. For detectives, the discovery of Gecht as the leader changed the investigation completely. They weren't just dealing with criminals, they were dealing with a cult leader who had convinced others to mutilate, torture, and kill in his name. What made Gecht even more dangerous was his intelligence. He knew how to conceal evidence, how to manipulate his crew, and how to present himself as harmless to the outside world. While his followers cracked under pressure, confessing their roles, Gecht managed to avoid direct murder charges. He was eventually sentenced to 120 years in prison, but not for the murders. Instead, he was convicted on charges of attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and assault. Judge Francis J. Mahan said it best at his sentencing, "Not even an animal would do these things. Only a devil or a monster would." David Gecht wasn't just a killer, he was a cult leader, a manipulator, and the dark heart of the Ripper crew. Without him, it's possible the others might never have committed such atrocities, but under his influence, Chicago became a hunting ground for one of the most sadistic cults in history. Behind David Gecht stood three other men, his loyal followers, who carried out his sadistic orders. Together they became known as the Ripper Crew. First was Edward Spreitzer, a man described as immature and impulsive. He wasn't the mastermind, but he was eager to please Gecht. Spreitzer not only helped kidnap and mutilate women, but also admitted to participating in random drive-by shootings ordered by Gecht. He was the kind of follower every cult leader relies on, obedient, unquestioning, and willing to commit horrific acts for approval. Then came the Kokoraleis brothers, Andrew and Thomas. Both were drawn into Gecht's influence, participating in kidnappings, assaults, and murders. Andrew, in particular, was deeply involved. His later trial revealed chilling details of necrophilia and his active role in the killings. For his crimes, Andrew was eventually sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 1999. Thomas Kokoraleis, however, was a different story. With a lower IQ and described as easily manipulated, Thomas claimed he was motivated more by fear than desire. He confessed to participating in the crimes, but his role was seen as less dominant. As a result, he received a lighter sentence, 70 years in prison. Incredibly, after serving decades behind bars, Thomas was released in 2019. Today, he walks free in Illinois, a fact that still unsettles many. Each member of the crew had a role to play, but together they created a nightmare far worse than any one man could have achieved. They hunted in packs, abducting women off the streets and dragging them into Gecht rituals. While Gecht provided the twisted ideology, the others provided muscle, compliance, and silence. The Ripper Crew's dynamic is one of the most terrifying aspects of this case. Serial killers typically act alone, driven by personal urges and obsessions. But the Ripper Crew operated like a cult, each member reinforcing the others, creating an environment where unthinkable crimes became normalized. The bond between the four men was built on blood, ritual, and fear. Together they left behind a trail of death and terror that made Chicago a city of fear in the early 1980s. When the trials finally began, many believed justice would be swift and absolute, but the outcomes revealed a troubling reality. Not all of the Ripper Crew would face the full weight of their crimes. David Gecht, the leader, was the most dangerous, yet prosecutors struggled to directly tie him to the murders. He had manipulated his followers into doing the killing, keeping his own hands clean. In the end, he was convicted not for murder, but for attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and assault, based on survivor testimonies. His sentence 120 years in prison. To this day, he remains behind bars. Edward Spreitzer faced trial in 1984. His defense argued that he was just a follower, immature and desperate for Gecht's approval, but the prosecution painted him as every woman's worst nightmare. In the end, Spreitzer avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to multiple murders. His sentence, life in prison without parole. Andrew Kokoraleis wasn't so lucky. In 1985, he was convicted of murder, assault, and kidnapping. Unlike Spreitzer, he was sentenced to death. Years later, in 1999, Andrew was executed by lethal injection, making him the only member of the crew to receive the ultimate punishment. Then there was Thomas Kokoraleis, with an IQ of 75 and no prior criminal record. His defense portrayed him as someone manipulated by Gecht, more motivated by fear than cruelty. He pleaded guilty, avoiding the death penalty, and was sentenced to 70 years. But in 2019, Thomas was released on parole. The news shocked Chicago. One of the men responsible for the Ripper Crew's crimes was now free, living among ordinary citizens. This uneven justice left many uneasy. Survivors, victims' families, and the public questioned how one of the most sadistic cult members in American history could ever walk free. For them, the thought of Thomas reintegrating into society felt like a cruel reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Today, the legacy of the Ripper crew remains one of horror, ritual, and partial justice. While most of the crew faced lifelong punishment, the fact that one walks free serves as a chilling reminder that evil can't always be contained. The story of the Ripper crew is more than just a true crime case. It's a nightmare of ritualistic violence, cult influence, and broken justice, a story that still echoes in Chicago, and one that reminds us how easily darkness can hide in plain sight. The Ripper crew claimed at least 18 lives, but to this day no one knows the true number of women who fell victim to their ritual. Some believe there are still bodies buried, stories untold, and families who never got closure. And with one member of the crew walking free today, the chilling question remains: what if the nightmare isn't yet over?